the all-important G7 meeting that is currently underway here in Evian in France, and tomorrow we will have the bilateral meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump. I'm now joined by a very special guest, the President of the Eurasia Group, Mr. Bremmer. Thank you very much, Mr. Bremmer, for joining us. I want to first talk about this Iran peace deal. Trump has announced it yesterday here in Evian as he arrived for the G7. He's also made a couple of things clear. He said that all this question of paying Iran any kind of reparations or $300 billion, all of that is fake news and so on and so forth. At the end of this 3-month war, what is your assessment? What has Trump really achieved? What has this war achieved for America?
So far, it's achieved nothing. So far, it's been the biggest foreign policy failure on Trump's watch. I hope, and I think the world hopes, that we will proceed and reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Of course, that's not an accomplishment of a war. That's actually been a consequence of the war that we're trying to undo, and had very significant economic impact for India, for the United States, for the global South, for pretty much everybody. So hopefully they can accomplish that. But that doesn't in any way force the Iranians to agree on their nuclear file. It does nothing on their ballistic missiles. It does nothing on the nature of this repressive regime, which is not going anywhere given the war. And in terms of whether or not the Iranians will be paid off, Trump, has been careful to say that there's no money being spent by American taxpayers. So that doesn't mean that Iranian assets won't be unfrozen. It doesn't mean that there won't be transfers provided directly by the Qataris, for example, just as it appears there's already been money that's been provided to Iran, essentially protection money from Gulf states to ensure the Iranians won't attack them. These things are not coincidental, and the Americans are not unaware that these things are going on. In the same way that the Americans allowed the Iranians to get a lot of oil out of the Strait in the early days, billions of dollars that this Islamic Republic made, that they're not spending that on humanitarian purposes, but the United States was concerned that energy prices were too high. So, I mean, almost on every front you look at it, this war has been a failure, and that's why Trump has been so focused on trying to get out of it on an off-ramp, even as he threatens the Iranians so many times, the end of their civilization, the infrastructure that America's going to hit, the oil that they're going to take, Carg Island that they'll seize. And yet, of course, none of those things actually transpired because, as it turned out, the United States did not, as Trump would put it, have the cards.
So, is it fair to say at the end of this 100-day-plus war that both on the battlefield and in the negotiations, Iran has won this war and America and Israel have lost?
No, it's not. It's not fair to say that because, I mean, the supreme leader was killed. Most of the military leaders were killed. A lot of their military capabilities have been hit hard, as well as their economic infrastructure. I mean, if you had a 4-month war between the United States and India, and Modi and half of the cabinet ended up dead, would you say that India had won that war? I don't think you would. So, I mean, I don't think there are winners here, but I do think that the Iranians have survived the war, and they come out of the war in a much more, let's say, important geostrategic position in the region. Now, that doesn't mean that the regime is going to be stable for the next 1, 2, 3 years. They're going to be under threat internally. Their economy is in parlous condition. But my point is that Trump has been able to accomplish literally none of the goals, at least to date, that he set out to accomplish when he and the Israelis started this war.
Just talking about the Israelis, Trump today in his comments in Evian has said, when he was asked about Netanyahu, he said that Israel wouldn't exist if it weren't for him. Israel wouldn't exist if it weren't for America. He gets along well with Bibi, but Bibi now needs to start becoming more responsible about Lebanon. I mean, he's clearly publicly sort of illustrated that both him and Bibi Netanyahu are not on the same page when it comes to this war, how to conclude this war. How do you think that plays out? After all, Israel is America's oldest ally in that sense.
Well, the quote is absurd. Israel has nuclear weapons and a significant force at that, and no other country in the region does. So the idea that Israel wouldn't exist if it weren't for Trump is on its face kind of crazy, right? But Trump, it does reflect Trump's irritation that Israel, which of course receives billions of dollars of military aid from the United States, and would not have been able to accomplish what it has in Iran without the Americans. And the U.S. has done a lot to help the Israelis defend themselves from the Iranians and from their proxies over the course of the Trump administration, and of course under Biden as well. Trump is angry that the Israelis aren't following him in lockstep. And I remember when Trump delivered that speech after the Phase 1 peace deal was agreed to in Gaza. He gave that speech to the Knesset in Israel, and the standing ovations and the outpour of popular support. Trump is much more popular among the Israeli population at large than Prime Minister Netanyahu. So how is it that this unpopular prime minister of a comparatively small country can call the shots when Trump is telling him what to do? That's what the frustration here is. And, you know, you'll note that the Americans and the Israelis together in lockstep went to war in Iran, but it's the United States that signed this agreement, the Memorandum of Understanding with the Iranians. The Israelis are not a signatory, and yet the war in Lebanon against Hezbollah is meant to be a component of the MOU. So how can the Americans be responsible for that if Israel is taking their own decisions?
Okay, and I also want to ask you about Prime Minister Modi and President Trump meeting tomorrow in the afternoon here in Evian. It's the first time both men will be meeting since February of 2025. A lot has transpired on the trade issue, the tariffs issue, the Russian oil issue. But the most pressing and the most immediate one is the shooting and killing of 3 Indian sailors by American Navy fire. How do you think these issues will be brought up in tomorrow's meeting?
Well, there should be an apology, obviously. My understanding is this was in Omani territorial waters. There's really no excuse for that. And I understand that neither the United States nor India wants a big fight over this. But, you know, much the same as when India and Canada had a very significant flap over a Canadian citizen that Canada said had been killed by the Indians. They expected an apology. They wanted to make sure it didn't happen again. I expect India expects an apology here. They want to make sure it doesn't happen again. These were Indian citizens that were minding their own business, and they were killed by the United States. In a mistake, obviously. They weren't intentionally targeted by the Americans, but nonetheless, it's a problem. I do think that both leaders want this relationship to maintain a level of stability. I think India has been disappointed that a lot of their leaning into the Quad and leaning into the U.S. relationship strategically, militarily, technologically, has not panned out as well as they would have liked, certainly not given the tariffs that came after Liberation Day. And I think India is hedging to a greater degree as a consequence. So I think the meeting will go well, but I'd be surprised if the headlines reflect a breakthrough of any sort.
All right, Mr. Ian Bremmer, we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for joining us with your thoughts and perspective here on Times Now.